This is our vision statement that we want to pioneer and develop a Jesus-shaped landscape on the West Coast. You can see with the language in there, pioneering and developing, that's fivefold ministry language, just translated in another way. Jesus-shaped landscape, Jesus-shaped has a lot to do with, that catalytic leader tool triangle that we've looked at. And then in some way, landscape has to do with the tool I'm going to show you, but we also mean geographically on the whole West Coast. This is the catalytic leader tool based on that Jesus-shaped life triangle of up, in, and out. And so our core values are that, we want Jesus as the North Star in the up dimension. And so we want to develop leaders that know how to be abiders, abiding in Christ. And some of the practicing the way testimony that you heard there, that's a part of it. We want people to be healthy leaders on their own, however that plays out in their local congregation. We also, in the in dimension, want people, to use practices. The practices of Jesus, we believe, in community will help form us. And so we want catalytic leaders who are equippers, and you could hear some of that. Fred was pushing for, is this getting into your leadership? Is this getting into your community? And you could hear the way that people are being equipped, released, and empowered to do the things that God's calling them to do, not something that a leader is calling them to do. Awesome. Great testimonies there. And in the out dimension, we want the proclamation of the gospel to be, something that is of the gospel of the kingdom demonstrated in both word and in deed. And so we want to see catalytic leaders who know how to be missionaries. I think I heard a lot of up and in testimonies, abiders and equippers. I think there's a little bit laundry love. Sounds like there's definitely some missional component that was there. I was trying to take notes of the different types of things and categorizing it while everybody was sharing, but I just didn't hear as much. I think that fits. I'm not trying to bring this as like this strong critique or corrective, but it does seem to be that, especially in the variety of contexts that everybody's in, you focus on up and in first, and then you always hope that you move to out. But I do know, too, from seeing many churches go through processes like this and come to terms with how do I hear God's voice and implement it, there are major hurdles that I think the enemy loves to pull strings on to keep the church in the building. And so I think crossing that line into missional work, I remember in Immersion 1, just an after hours, after party time, Courtney was a part of the conversation, so it's like this phrase that I'll bring up and she'll bring up from time to time, but others were there too. But John Wimber had said, the meat is in the street. You know how some people like desiring Bible study, like, Pastor, we just want to go deeper. We want to get into the meat of the word. And there's this idea that usually lends itself toward intellectualism, or like, I want to be right and I want to own that person that I'm in the argument with about Jesus. But John Wimber had said, actually, the meat is on the street. Get your community, get your people, get yourself out of the building to where real people are. That's where the meat is. It's not just in more intellectualism and understanding the Bible more and owning somebody in the next online argument that you happen to get into. So we think that we need to be an association in partnership with other associations, developing these kinds of leaders, abiders, equippers, and missionaries for today. So, how do you form catalytic leaders? That's kind of the question I'm starting from and want to use as a catalyst to be able to get into this tool called the landscape of life. Let's frame it like this. God loves to encounter his people. He loves to show up. He's the God who came in the flesh and spent 30 plus years hanging out before he even proclaimed his ministry publicly, hung out with the people. You see all throughout the Old Testament, God showing up in sometimes very dramatic ways, sometimes very simple, quiet ways. But nonetheless, God loves to encounter his people. Not just special people, not just gifted people. Every single human being in your city, God created, knows, loves, and has something that a history, a conversation that he's been communicating to them. And if you had the chance and the grace to sit down and actually hear a random individual's conversation about all kinds of ups and downs, tragedies, difficulties, success, and failure, you would hear a story of a God who's been pursuing them. They may not have responded to him. They may be running from him. They may be ignoring him. They may be moving close and then pulling away. All kinds of patterns exist, but nonetheless, I know God loves to reach every single person because that's just who he is. It's his character and his nature. And these types of moments that are in anybody's story and are in your story, those kairos moments that you have and you hold really dear, those precious ones about how maybe it was mystical, and you're like, it's going to sound crazy when I tell you what happened, but we have those kinds of things. Or maybe it was like, went through the most difficult thing in my life, summer of 2021, but God. See, it's all connected back to this God who loves to break through into the normal in our lives. And so these kairos moments are all moments that are pregnant for change. So how are catalytic leaders formed? By encountering that God, learning to hear what he says, and then do something about it on the other side of it. And so there's 4 kinds of moments that we can see that typically happen in any person's life. And I'm going to unpack this over here on the whiteboard. The first kind of a moment with, let's just call them God encounters. The first kind of moment looks a little like this. We'll call that a mountain. And I'd categorize like this. They're eruptive moments. The reason that they're eruptive is because that mountain is not just, ground and rock. It's a mountain that's like a volcano. And the magma, the lava of that volcano, sometimes erupts into the moment. So think about Moses in his story, the burning bush. He comes into contact with God. He sees the burning bush. He moves closer. Take off your shoes. I'm going to send you. Think about Isaiah's encounter. Like, it was this time that Uzziah died, and then he has this vision of the Lord. Who will go for us? Here, it's these eruptive moments where the presence of God breaks through in oftentimes dramatic ways. It tends to be positive as a whole, but usually there's a whole bunch of fear of the Lord in the mix of it. You could go back through so many different people throughout the scriptures and go, what are those eruptive moments that they had? You can see it there. For me, I remember I was at a learning community. This was probably 2010, and somebody had just done an opening talk. And the guy's name is Mike Breen, and he was given this word, and he's like, oh, by the way, before we get going, I feel like the Lord wants to heal a few people today. And before I had arrived to the learning community, I had been praying this: God, I want whatever you've got for me, and I won't be offended however it comes. Dangerous kind of prayer like that. And so that had been my heart's cry for a while. So here I am, and I'm like, I want to be healed. And I'm remembering, because he had kind of a word of knowledge. I think here's a few things that the Lord wants to heal, this and this. And one of them was this back pain, and he described what it was like. And I'm like, I have that. I've just grown numb to the pain because it's just there all the time. And so I stand up, I receive prayer, and nothing happens. So, Lord, I want whatever you want, and I won't be offended no matter what. Then I go into teaching time, and I end up in a huddle, and I'm in this huddle, and the guy that's leading the huddle, you're going to see the jerk version of Michael in this story. The guy that's leading the huddle, I called the Fruit Loop, because there was just something about him, I didn't want to learn from him. I didn't want to hear. I'm like, this guy doesn't have anything to share with me. But he leads the huddle, and I'm like, oh, great. I wish I would have been in so-and-so's huddle instead. And so I'm there, Fruit Loop's leading the huddle, and he's like, oh, hey, didn't you stand up to receive healing? Yes, I did. Did anything happen? I'm like, Fruit Loop, don't call me out in the middle of all this. And no, I didn't get healed. Oh, great. We'll pray for you before we wrap up with huddle today. So we go on from there. I hope he forgets. We go through, and he actually leads a really good huddle, by the way. So here I am, humbled, okay, no, this is really good. I'm glad to be in Fruit Loop's huddle. And here's what God's saying to me. Here's what I'm beginning that process that we go through in huddle. And we get to the end, and he remembers. He's like, oh, hey, let's pray for Michael. And so he calls everybody to gather around, pray super simple prayer. And in the middle of it, dude, I get rocked. Because the only way I can describe it, like what happened, is it felt like there was a piece of meat the size of like kind of where the pain was on my back that was the same temperature as my body. And it felt literally like it just was lifted off one piece, like it was just folding, and like I'm feeling every bit of it. And I just, whatever it's like to experience the power of God in the moment, like I'm just not on fire, like hot, but like just like the energy of God is just flowing through me in that moment, and His presence is there, and I'm like, oh my goodness, oh my, like, and then, we all celebrate and stuff like that. And that healing, turned into a bunch of other moments, but it was this incredible eruptive time that I can look back at. The presence of God was there and met me in an experience that I can see His fingerprints and radical change in my life coming on the other side of it. So that's an eruptive moment. There are others that I have. There are others that you have. And so I want you to even be thinking about, like, what are the ways that the God who loves to encounter, how has she shown up in your life? And if you were to rank them, what are the top 3 to 5 eruptive moments that you've had? Generally positive, mountaintop-like experiences. And then what I didn't hit on, in the way that I'd say the calling part that you see on the screen, there often included calling. What took place is I did get healed that day, but where calling translates into it is that it was like the somewhat of the beginning of my journey to learn how to pray for healing for people. That's really like the thing that the Lord was doing. It was a marker for me. And there are other eruptive moments on that journey of learning to be an ambassador for the kingdom of heaven and a conduit of His grace. The other kind of moment, let's call erosive moments. And so these are like this. And so instead of mountaintop experience, these erosive moments are generally negative, where like the wind and the water, will wear away naturally in a natural landscape. But what happens in human life is, like, in the difficulty that we go through, usually over long periods of time, what happens is we end up coming into we end up coming into contact with the same God who was in the eruption, but just in the lowest parts of our life. You've probably ministered to people in your congregation, or this might be the testimony of some people. I never would have asked for cancer, but God met me through the journey. I never would have wanted to, usually that's the kind of way that a testimony like this happens. And it's not that the cancer was great or the negative experience was great, but it's the God who met me when I didn't know what the heck I was going to do. And He met me in a way that, I don't know what it's like in your life, but I know you've got stories like this where the God who loves to encounter just showed up in your life and you're like, it was really, really bad. And when you remember Him meeting you there. Usually they occur over a long period of time. So think about like biblical stories. I usually go to David from the time where he was anointed king by Samuel before he was crowned king. That's a long, erosive season, running from Saul, trying to work the relationship out, dealing with all kinds of Saul's issues in the process, and he's running, and it's in that time frame God's developing and usually doing something at a deep level to wear away. I think the erosive part is, hey, let's look at this character flaw you have, and let's start to address it, and let's bring some healing there. And usually, like, we meet God in that moment, and He just does some really, really important things there. It's, again, that thing that you're like grateful for on the other side. If I think of an erosive season in my life, I think one that would be somewhat similar to some of the stories that are here. Man, when you're in ministry, you end up with so many. You're like, which one do you tell? And how do you make it short? Because a lot of times there's so many threads attached to it. Yeah, so I was originally like on a team and I wasn't the senior leader. And so I'm in a role similar to some of you here where I'm like an associate pastor. At the time I was the associate pastor of discipleship, and walking in step with senior leadership, doing all the stuff that you guys are reporting on, and then discovering through the course of time that I'm not being told everything about what's going on. And so I'm trying to solve problems with the leader that, the community is facing, like, hey, the board wants to know about vision. I'm like, well, I love talking about vision stuff. So we're like whiteboarding visions. Let's do this. And I'm thinking that I'm like helping to meet this need of a person that I've come to love and love working with. But what I discover is that the board has been holding this person accountable on 14 standards, one of which is the lack of vision casting in the community, others having to do with things that are potentially illegal. Eventually, the board calls for that senior leader's resignation, and I get called into a board meeting myself. I met the senior leader as I'm walking in. He had just come out of a meeting. He's like, hey, they're going to ask you to lead in the interim, and they just asked for my resignation. Oh my goodness. I step into the meeting. That's what happens, they ask. And I had a couple like, whoa, we've been moving forward in like this discipleship culture thing. We can't give that up. I can't lead like an interim, and I have a job here. So are you wanting me to like, interim usually is like you're here for a short period of time and then you say goodbye, and worked out all of those things. But that period of then leading on the other side of that was just really, really difficult. The board making a really strong decision like that in a small town. I mean, you can imagine all the opinions that people had about those board members and the motives that those board members had. And leading on the other side of all that, I usually then said, I had the honor of leading. We were running at like 800 people before that. I had the honor of leading our church to our lowest average attendance in 20 years. And we went through this weaning away and accusation in the community and, loads of challenge. And then if some of you remember some stories that I've told before, it was then just 1 year later, as the now leader of this church community, getting the call that like, hey, one of your leaders running Celebrate Recovery has been arrested for child molestation. And so then going through that in a small town, and that wave hitting the church, that's where the lowest average attendance came from on the other side. But, see, this is what happens with erosive moments. Horrible, 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 horrible. But God showed up in amazing ways through that time frame. I'd never wish that story on anybody else, but God met me in some ways that like are so important for what he was doing in my life. Those are erosive moments. What are the top 3 to 5 erosive moments that you've gone through? Write those down. Because again, we're wanting to seed this community with more common language because we think sharing these stories is a really good way to glue a community together, but there's really important stuff that comes from it on the other side. This kind of a moment, different. They're both negative in the way that they're like low, but this one, the erosive, happens really slowly, but earthquake happens, instantaneously. It's trying to draw like a fault line there. And so in those earthquake moments, it's like the call that you get in the middle of the night that you didn't want to get. So it's generally negative, happens really quickly. It often will lead to like an erosive season on the other side, but it's like that moment. So for me, it was that call in the middle of the night, hey, so-and-so got arrested for child molestation. One call changes everything, and then you've got to work it out on the other side. I remember another erosive, like Job. Let's go biblical like example. Job is the like go-to. If you go back and reread the book of Job, those first 2 chapters, but don't read the parts where you know what's happening in the divine council. and see really what Job goes through. It's crazy. Like when you get the narrator's perspective about like the divine council scenes, sure, it's still like, oh, poor Job. But when you think about it without knowing that this testing thing is going on and what God's doing in it, it's crazy and painful. I remember we were doing ministry in Central California. My youngest daughter was taking a shower. She tended to take long showers. I don't know if any of your kids do that. And like, why is she taking so long? I go back, honey, what's going on? She doesn't say anything. Come on, why are you taking so long? And opening the door and I thought she was joking. She was like leaning against the shower wall like this. I thought she was just lounging. I'm mad. What are you doing? What's going on? I go in there and she's seizing. And she's been seizing for potentially a little while. And so we get her out of the shower and call 911. My brother is the first responder that shows up. He was on the PD at the time. He administers CPR. And, the world slows down in moments like that. I can still see scenes of, clothing her, crying out to the Lord, watching my brother run down the hallway, giving her CPR, seeing her carted off into the ambulance. And I didn't hear it directly, but as you know, you unpack the story later on, like the EMTs that came and took her, they thought she was going to continue to code and that she wouldn't make it to the hospital. She did. We send out the prayer, everybody pray, this is going on. And so Kimberly and I are driving, I'm racing, following the ambulance. And by the time we get there, she's alert, coherent, like everybody's amazed that she's alive. And then we kind of go through this process of unpacking it. But it was that call or that moment, of encountering this life-threatening thing with this person who's so dear. What was interesting, that line at the very bottom, his presence isn't always experienced immediately. In the middle of it, it felt like the absence of God. I was getting angry at the Lord, like, you promised this, you said this, where are you? I don't see you here. That was me driving real fast behind the ambulance. But what was amazing is we unpacked those testimonies, you could hear like God was all over it. I just couldn't see him. It's the same thing again. It's the same presence that you come into contact with, on the mountain and in the erosion that is still there in the earthquake. What are yours? What moments have you experienced where the God who loves to break through was there in that call that you had hoped that you would never have gotten? Last one is this very different quality moment. Very smooth lines here. And these are excavation moments. And I'll depict it with something like a shovel. This is where we learn to dig on a daily, weekly, monthly, seasonal, practicing the way kind of basis to encounter the God of the mountain and the God of the valley and the God of the earthquake in whatever, still small voice, daily devotions, fasting, praying, all of the different kinds of spiritual disciplines. This is where we learn to put our hand to the shovel and get some calluses to come into contact with the same God that met us in the dramatic ways, but meeting us in the daily ways, where like we are people of the presence, and I know how to walk in the presence of God. I don't require a mountaintop experience. Have you had people in your communities who are like just hungry for that mountaintop experience and they like try to gear up their life and ramp up their energy levels? I love a good mountaintop experience. Never turn one down from the Lord. Lord, bring them. But there are people, it's almost like they swing back and forth like between these two moments, almost like bipolar Christians. I got to be one or the other to get the presence of the Lord. Actually, if we just do the way of Jesus, and learn to encounter his presence on a daily basis. It may not be sexy like the eruptive moment, but man, his presence is there. He loves to break through. What I've discovered, that leaders that I've come to really admire aren't the ones who have just the dramatic stories. They have those, but they work from here. This is where they live from. And there's a power, thinking of covenant and kingdom triangles. We've talked through that. You'll see that again later in our time frame together. But they just received the identity that the king had given to them by grace. They received the authority. They stepped out. And because they're people who walk in the presence, they just, where they go, the presence breaks through. So, what are your moments? Here's a few takeaways. I'm just going to read these for time's sake. So you're responsible to steward the calling that's on your life, utilizing all the resources that are available to you. I don't know that I've said this quite clearly, so I'll say it real specifically here. Remember how I was saying, like, every person in your community has these kinds of stories, if you had the chance and the honor to hear them from them. And these are like the fingerprints of the God who has a unique call on their life. If you actually go back and spend the excavation time to unpack these three types of encounters that you have, you'll probably go, oh, that's why I'm so passionate about. Oh, that's why I'm always doing. It's because it's like, these are the means that like God uses to like form people into the people that are mobilized into the things that he has. So you've got to discern and steward that calling, utilizing all the resources you have. That Father who loves you so much, he's developing Christ-like character in you through all the challenges that you face. You can trust his leadership. I'm preaching that to myself right now. You can trust his leadership in any situation, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. His grace is sufficient. I wish it wasn't true that his power is made perfect in weakness. I wish his power was made perfect in strength. I'd way rather have that. But, his power is made perfect in weakness. God's revealed himself to you. He shaped your character in the most difficult moments of your life in the past. You may not have been able to feel his presence, but you can rest assured of his goodness through all those things. And you can learn to partner well with him in the new things that he's revealing. It may not be easy. Again, I'm preaching to myself. It may not be easy to partner with him in the new thing. Maybe the last lesson doesn't fully equip you, but you can still trust his goodness and follow him through everything that you go through. And then you can respond to the eruptive moments and the erosive moments and earthquake moments because you're not in control of them happening. You can position yourself for them and then respond when they come. But, man, this is where the gold is, friends. You can learn to do excavation. You can learn to encounter the presence of God on a daily basis, weekly basis, and be a person of his presence. What we're wanting to do, these catalytic leaders, we've got to learn to be deep leaders with the capacity to lead deep communities so that when people enter into our orbit, they're encountering an embodied presence of the King. So, here's kind of how we're going to take that stuff and other things into this community this time frame. We've got a few practices we're going to be playing with, some that are very similar to what you've done before. Those of you that are new, I'll walk through this. We're going to have devotions, throughout our time together. We'll worship together. We're going to have this after party time where we hang out and just like talk and catch up, and make sure you take advantage of those times. It's very intentional to build the connections we're wanting to build. We'll have coffee breaks and show and tells. The inputs, the teaching input, the first one right there, landscape of life, check. We're going to do formation and fivefold ministry. We're going to do one called cultural earthquake. We're going to talk about Jesus in the desert, how he was tested and tempted there. And then something about our calling. You're called. We'll be using processing, a SWOT analysis in just a little bit. We'll do huddles, huddle 1 and 2. We're going to share our stories. We're going to have a session, like a workshop session, on how do you actually pray for healing for people of peace. We're going to give you some time to practice some solitude. We're going to give you and buy you an hour of time to just seek the presence of the Lord during that time. And we'll walk out with some strategic plans like we've done before. And then we've got meals, snacks, drinks, conversations, and reflection, like many of you have come to know, come through these time frames.